Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. A podcast where we make experts great again and contribute actively to the public debate and policymaking around commodities, the geopolitics of energy, and trade. I'm your host. It's February 2026, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. So I mentioned the host, Leslie Palti-Guzman, and my guest today is Rachel Ziamba. She's the geoeconomic and country risk expert and runs Ziemba Insights, an advisory firm. And she is particularly expert and focused on the role of coercive economic statecraft policies, including sanctions. And we're going to talk a lot today about Iran, Venezuela, maybe a little bit Russia, but all about how we've used with those countries economic leverage. And I'm very excited to have Rachel back on the podcast. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Leslie. Always good to talk so many aspects of energy policy with you.
Yes, and you know what? Last time you joined was June 18, 2025. And we discussed Iran, Israel, and scenarios for escalation and energy disruptions. And 3 days later, on June 21st, the US bombed with the B 2 and struck the nuclear facilities in Iran. So, what happened 3 days from today's recording is everybody's guess, right?
Yeah, but it definitely seems like, well, let's just say a lot of military hardware is in place that could facilitate an escalation. So,
Yes. So,
might
yeah,
not
I mean, the
happen three
context.
days from now, but definitely seems like the chances have risen again.
Yes,
Even
I
if
agree. I mean, there is
yeah.
definitely what we see is an absence of breakthrough in the nuclear talks between the
Mhm.
US and Iran. So it makes the probability of potential US and or Israeli military intervention,
Mhm.
higher. And we've
Correct.
seen a sustained level of higher prices on oil and gas recently. So the timing, the shape, the form of such an operation remains, it's unknown, but it could range from surgical, very selective strikes to overwhelming and a regional campaign. And as you mentioned, like the US has been building up, readiness for intense airstrike campaign, and as early potentially as this weekend, we have another aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, expecting stood in position in the region, in the Middle East. There is already the Abraham Lincoln carrier. So a lot of military hardware right now. But meanwhile, the regime in Iran may be at one of its weakest points in decades. Ideologically, economically, militarily, we've seen unparalleled high domestic discontent, unrest. So, given this context, Rachel, like a big picture question first, like to what extent sanctions can claim credit for Iran's current weakness?
I think the sanctions pressure has added to Iran's weakness. It's built gradually over time. There were also choices that Iran's regime made, not only to not negotiate, but also choices about not investing in power and water infrastructure, choices about how to run the economy. In a way, the coping mechanisms that Iran's regime and the IRGC chose helped their resilience for many years, but now are coming back to haunt it. We have an economy that is increasingly where many companies are controlled by the military, where and where those power and water and other infrastructure shortages have really been building on the regime. And this is
Yeah.
happening at a time where Iran is one of the countries that is experiencing temperature volatility. We're in the cold season now, But, Iran is a country where in the summers it gets really hot. And so these water and power shortages have built. So I think sanctions are definitely a part of it, but how the regime responded is a factor. And then the other issue, I think, Leslie, you pointed back, right, to our conversation in the summer, which was at a time after which a combination of Israeli and sometimes with the US pressure on some of Iran's friends have left Iran without without as many, as many allies. So I do think there's a number of factors at play here.
Yeah, so a combination of factors. And when you look at the different sanctions that have been used against Iran over the years, some more financial, some on the oil and gas sector, some on shipping enforcement, military equipments. Do you think some have been more effective at constraining the regime's capacity and options than others?
I think that's right. In a way, what the US has done is used mostly financial tools to constrain some of these other sectors. So, yes, both cutting off Iranian banks from the global financial system, but also they use financial tools to restrict energy trade. Now, Iran is one of a few countries that actually really pioneered new illicit ways of getting their oil to market, with
Yeah, and
China as
on this point, I just wanted to say, you said pioneer. It even like created the template, like the playbook for
exactly.
Russia to
Exactly.
with the shadow fleet, with the network of illegal, obscure
Correct.
companies,
Yeah.
shadow companies. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And unlike, I think, Russia, which until recently there was sort of some quasi legal trade that Russia was engaged in, with Iran's case, especially since Trump exited the JCPOA back in 2019, we have really had Iran, that in order to keep some of its revenues and energy exports flowing, it really had to rely more on these illicit techniques, and really was part of, as you say, building this evasive infrastructure that then was turbocharged by Russia using the shadow fleet. And Iran helped pass on some tricks to the Venezuelans as well,
right.
though they have been less involved in the last few years. And of course, since the events of the very beginning of this year, Venezuela is no longer a big factor for the shadow fleet, and Russia sort of took over that relationship. So I think that again, it's a bit of a combination. What I think is a bit different right now is that you have this combination of military threat and financial sanctions pressure. The US is constrained on how much they can ramp up financial pressure because of their bilateral relationship with China, just because China is the main buyer, and that some of and
So
that
China is buying about what? I mean, I think Iranian oil is flowing at 80% to China, right? Something like that. Like basically, China is giving Iran a lifeline, right?
Correct. Yes, China is giving Iran a lifeline, and most of the other the trade that goes to other countries, it goes there intermediately and then ends up in China. Now, of course, when you are the only buyer, just like when you're the only seller, you may have more leverage. And China is able to negotiate very large discounts on that oil. And so, even though Iranian export volumes have been near recent records, their revenues have not been, right? The revenues continue to be under pressure. But
Yeah.
the way I'd characterize, we've seen since the beginning of the year and at various points since the middle of last year, new sanctions on tankers, vessels that are used to carry the oil, new financial pressure. These did escalate and add some pressure, especially last year. But most of the new measures, in my view, are what I'd call maintenance sanctions, that they have maintained the pressure. And they've more responded to the fact that when a shell company or a vessel is sanctioned, a new one pops up in its place. So that to maintain sanctions pressure, you can't just stay still. You need
Right.
to continue to close loopholes.
Yeah. So at this stage, some days President Trump says we're still, favoring a diplomatic option. We still want negotiations, give the chance to diplomacy. So if Washington truly, wanted to try to tighten the screws economically without escalating militarily, like what would be the most effective lever? Yeah, like whether it's oil enforcement on the shadow fleet ecosystem, like what can be done really to choke off supply and just economically speaking,
Mhm.
completely remove any lifeline to the regime. You mentioned
Mhm.
China, of course, but that's not easy.
No, no, it's not. So I think what you need to do is, really target the buyers in some way that has its political costs, and that could be done in two different ways. One would be returning to more sanctions on some of the teapot refineries and some of the ports involved in accepting the China the accepting the Iranian supplies.
And
That's
these are
something
mostly
in
those
China.
in China, mostly in China. Yeah.
In China. There's also a possibility. We know that there are Indonesian and Malaysian entities involved as intermediaries. There are also Emirati entities. Some of the shell companies involved have been sanctioned, right? But what we've not seen is refinery or port infrastructure entities involved. Now, that's partly, there are a few reasons why that's the case. One is that would be seen as a real challenge to China. Um, and the U.S. has different goals with respect to its China policy. The other one, especially for countries in Southeast Asia or even the Emirates, is again that the U.S. is balancing a range of different economic interests, including, the UAE has become closer to the U.S. and Israeli policy, and has its own links there. Also, is a major partner that the U.S. is trying to work on critical minerals in Africa. They're Pressure
Right.
on Iran would come with trade-offs in other bilateral relationships. And
Yeah.
so as a result, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is to some degree, military enforcement of sanctions via occasional tanker seizures. And I've particularly been noting this. We've seen even the Indians starting to get involved in escorting tankers sanctioned for their Iran trade out of Indian waters. And this, of course, is linked to U.S. pressure on India and U.S. India relations on the sort of trade and investment side.
Yeah, it was very interesting to see this increase of tanker seizures since even the beginning of 2026.
Mm-hmm.
More monitoring of ship to ship transfer and increased surveillance in general on waters, just to document all this
Mm-hmm.
concealment, right? All of this network of concealments and evasion of sanctions.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, it's how realistically the U.S. will want to go after Chinese entities, refiners, financial intermediaries, and not just China. You mentioned the UAE and other allies to the U.S. So very interesting developments. Like what's very interesting to me is that, and you mentioned that also earlier, like we have this kind of axis of evasion, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
between Iran, Venezuela, Russia. And at the end of the day, China is the glue also between all of them. And it
Sure.
is a very decisive variable in a way. And like, is it all about China? Like what we've seen in Venezuela and now in Iran? Like, is it a way for the US to finally dismantle this illicit oil trade? and everything that links those rock states together?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Of course, it's always challenging to dismantle a whole system involving a significant amount of production. It's notable to me that they went first after Venezuela, which is the smallest, and maybe one of the weaker links in this chain. That a combination of sanctions and economic mismanagement led, and actually U.S. sanctions enforcement led Venezuelan production down to less than 1 million barrels a day. And so starting at that point after both production in the Americas and core OPEC production moved up, right? Because we had oil prices coming down. You had, different views about how oversupplied the market was and is, but still an environment where there was a little more space. Now, Iran, obviously a larger producer, as you say, China is the biggest, is the biggest buyer, the lifeline. And Russia is really much a bigger fish. And the US, if anything, has not been doing as much to sort of enforce and crack down on the shadow fleet there. They did some very important sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies back in October. Those were the only meaningful financial pressure measures taken against Russia and the energy sector in this Trump administration. But they did push Russia more into these illicit channels and actually more competing with Iran and Venezuela. So I do think part of this story is reducing China's ability to sort of provide these lifelines. For Venezuela, I think this is part of a U.S. desire to have China and other players have less of a role in the hemisphere. And in Venezuela's case, it was not only about the oil and the oil upside, but also about the cartels, the sort of Venezuela as a source of migrants to the United States. There were a few other dynamics. With Iran, of course, there's other regional security dynamics at play. One thing I note, in a sense, since the end of last year, is we've had this shift in U.S. rhetoric away from, at the end of as you had the protests picking up in Iran that had an economic and sanctions pressure trigger, you had an element where the US administration started to say, oh, maybe we'll bomb Iran to support the protesters and try to push out the regime. What we've seen more recently is a little more of a muddled justification, in a way, as the US government is both hoping for regime change and policy change, but also is holding out the prospect of a deal with that regime that a few weeks ago they said they wanted to bomb to support the Iranian people. So I do think at the end of the day, there's a bit of uh, there's an iterative process, a little bit of opportunistic response, and also caution in the US that they don't want to get into a escalating tit for tat conflict that might undermine the flow not only of Iranian barrels but of the Gulf barrels of oil and gas that flow through the Strait of Hormuz, right? Which just given the concentration of energy flows.
Mhm. For me, there is maybe another element with this idea that if the U.S. managed to successfully to dismantle a lot of this illicit trade, from Iran, from Russia, it could also reaffirm the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. And this is something that I've written a
Mm-hmm.
lot
Yeah.
about in recent months, is that we have this kind of ecosystem that has thrived on maritime opacity,
Yes.
especially in the Red Sea, with the Houthi facilitating and enabling this trade, but also increasingly potentially in the Arctic, in the North Sea
Mm-hmm.
route. So, like for me, the Houthi in Yemen have really become this maritime enabler of sanctioned oil transits, and particularly the Chinese trade also. So all the actors that have evaded recent sanctions, And actually, we've seen that a Russian tanker was caught.
Mm-hmm.
It was destined to China, but it was in the Red Sea. Anyway, there was a whole saga with this tanker. And we've seen also that the Houthis were not touching any of the trades from the non-Western tankers or insurance, but all the Western ones had to reroute around the Cape
Mm-hmm.
of Good Hope, making their trades more expensive and logistically more complicated.
Correct. Yeah.
So, like for me, it would be a way maybe to reassert Western authority on those routes. And also, at the end of the day, with these routes, China is also waging a geoeconomic war in a way,
Sure.
because it really facilitated its trade, make it more economic in a way, and kind of avoided all the rule-based order with those sea lanes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it's interesting, you can kind of differentiate between two different Chinese parts of the sea lanes, the commercial and the energy trade. And the energy trade going, to China, or even from Russia's European ports through to China and India until recently, could follow through. However, some of the Chinese container ships on their way to Europe still had to divert, but the Chinese were able to pass on those additional costs to the Europeans of the goods that were coming from China. So you really see this element of these parallel structures, and China is still very much playing in both markets. And underpinning a lot of this, you're right to sort of, and you've done great work, I think, highlighting this role of the Houthis and the Red Sea. But there's also this element that some of these shifts that have happened have actually led to a concentration of ownership among the tanker fleet, right? We see more Greek and Southern European owners of VLCCs selling them off to the sort of highest bidder, either in the clean fleet and the shadow fleet. We see Asian actors buying up a lot of tankers, bidding up tanker rates. And so there's a lot of shifts going on. And then we continue to see an environment where sanctions are both a lifeline for these old rickety vessels, but they're also a constraint on scrapping them. And those elements of maritime security are even a risk for China, right? China doesn't allow the oldest, ricketiest vessels to come into their ports. They insist they do ship to ship transfers. So, I think you're right. I think we have a parallel process whereby the US and Europe are among the actors who are trying to dismantle parts of the shadow fleet, and they have different priorities. But the net result is, as you say, more seizures, more pressure. The question mark is one of enforcement and political will, and also, as you say, a willingness, to exert financial pressure, including on China. And there are definitely voices in Washington and even in Brussels whose preference is to try to increase pressure in the short term in the hopes that one could really deal some meaningful blows to some of the nodes of this trade. The Europeans traditionally don't have as much capability in enforcing their sanctions as the Americans do, but they have more impact via the opportunity to withhold their own demand and their own services. And that's what's at stake in this 20th sanctions package on Russia, which who knows what will happen with it by the time this airs. But that there is a real move from the Europeans to ban European provision of maritime services, which in a sense would be the death blow to the oil price cap, and would really just be saying, you know what? There shouldn't be a legal way for Russia to sell its barrels of oil and I guess some natural gas. The Europeans aren't ready to completely undermine Russian natural gas because they're still buying some, right? At least
Yeah.
until
Well,
early 2027.
yeah, I think the 20th package would also harm a lot all the logistics of maintenance and services for the tankers used for the Yamal LNG project. So right
Yeah,
now there are still European companies and ports that are servicing the ice tankers and ice class tankers. So that could be very interesting, because it would make complicate even further the whole trade of this project, which is already very, very, harmed
correct.
financially and so on. So let me zoom out, Rachel, and to conclude, maybe like a broader question. Like, in your opinion, do you think that the U.S. is overstretching its economic leverage and tools of using sanctions, or do you think that because the US is still, we have the dollars, there is a lot of big capital market. Like, do you think that it's still a very effective tool? And mostly, the US has been using those against adversaries, right?
Mhm.
So, like, how do you think about it?
Yeah. So I think there is still power, via the U.S. financial system to impose sanctions, but it is more effective when it is done in coordination, right? We saw this, even if it wasn't a death blow, but we saw this with G7 plus coordination on Russia. It tends to also be more effective when there's a real economic size disparity between countries. Adversary, authoritarian nations that have, already turned inward, it tends to be difficult to impose that pressure, especially if there is a large buyer whose interest, and that's China, whose interest is in undermining. So I think the Trump administration came in not wanting to use financial pressure in the same way against targets like Russia and China, and preferring instead either to use tariffs, which could generate revenue, or to focus sanctions on smaller regimes or on non-state actors like cartels. Now, they've ended up still using financial pressure, but there are limitations. Now, one thing that's interesting to watch in the Venezuelan context right now is that, first, by having the military blockade and then seizing Maduro, and then using select sanctions relief, the US has actually channeled more of Venezuela's oil back onto global markets, back using the US dollar, back through Western companies mostly, though India is also buying. Now, this isn't enough to really change the dynamics and demand for the dollar, but it is an interesting sort of signpost to look at in the future, especially if there's some sort of resolution or some sort of significant deal between the US and Iran, or maybe some sort of regime change. Could we see some sort of circumstance where Iran comes back to the market in a meaningful way? The other thing I guess I would say is there are a couple of domestic policy choices that are limiting the role of the dollar and thus US financial sanctions pressure. One of those is both on the fiscal policy side, and the other is on the sort of tariff volatility, and the US willingness to use not just secondary tariffs on allies, but also to use a tariff threat on allies such as those in Europe. Now, actually exercising that on major trading partner like Europe, doesn't seem very credible. But to the extent that trust is lost and institutions are undermined between these highly interconnected, developed financial markets, that, in my mind, could weaken the power of the US to impose financial sanctions and other tools.
Because
And it's
because those partners will want to hedge and diversify and limit their risk, right?
correct. And because it also has implications on defense ecosystem. I mean, it's not easy for Europe to suddenly start building, especially a cohesive defense ecosystem. First of all, every country wants to be the one that is supplying, their own or other countries, and it's difficult in that way. But I do think we're starting to see measures like the UK stepping up and saying, well, Do we need a new credit card payment system so that Visa and MasterCard and US technology companies can't cut off our citizens? So I think we start to see some degree of fraying in these highly interconnected systems, which adds friction. And economists would say this isn't efficient. But I don't think we live in a world that is just about efficiency. So I guess those are some of the metrics I would watch. Um, and, the other part of the story, though, is at this point, there isn't really meaningful alternatives. The Chinese are still ambivalent about some use of their currency beyond their borders. But the US shouldn't count on that always being the case.
Right. So fascinating. And best case scenario would be following Venezuela to have a regime change in Iran that is more American friendly, Western friendly, dollar friendly, and then it will be a big win for the US.
Yeah, it would be. I guess the challenge is what's interesting is you in Venezuela, you had a leadership change, but not necessarily a regime change. But that has facilitated some meaningful policy changes. And whether that continues will depend not only, on the choices that the new members of the sort of the government are making, but also on whether the US allows some of the proceeds from the oil to flow into to Venezuela. But I think with Iran, it could be more complicated to think about who might the next leaders be, what their interests are. And of course, we have this particular, we have these real security threats, including the nuclear program, the missile program, the regional dynamics. And so I do see it as being more complicated in those contexts. And also, both the fact that this is happening at the same time that the US and others are trying to put pressure on Russia. Maybe there's an upside there of some sort of resolution, but untangling all of that, I think, is going to keep all of us busy thinking about what are the actual energy market impacts and versus what are just the threats.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And before I let you go on a busy weekend, I wanted to ask you one personal question.
Sure.
So I know you have another expertise in wine. So tell us a little bit how you diversified. I think it's on Substack. You can give us a plug on your newsletter too. And how did you decide to, is it more than a hobby? Do you think that it's important to expand your horizon? How did you think about this?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say it's more than a hobby. I run some wine tastings here in New York City and actually in Vancouver, mostly either for charity. And it started a bit as a pandemic project that I decided I was going to study wine a little more seriously. So that was one theme. But the other is that alcohol is a very regulated industry, as it should be, right? As an intoxicant, and that I noticed back in the, sort of 5, 6 years ago that wine was often used in trade disputes, either and
Especially with the French.
spirits too. Yes, exactly. So we had in the first Trump administration tariffs on many European wines as retaliation for an Airbus Boeing dispute over aircraft. So I thought that was interesting. And even if you go back to the WTO cases, back when the WTO actually had a functioning appellate panel and you could use that process, a number of them related to alcohol. National treatment. Were the Japanese and Koreans prioritizing their own spirits over international ones? And yes, no surprise, the answer is yes. And so I started doing some work on how the alcohol trade was weaponized. It's also been weaponized by the Chinese and the Russians. And so for the last 4 or 5 years, I presented papers at the American Association of Wine Economists, and I write about wine trade, alcohol trade on Substack at Journeys in Wine Economics. And just put a piece early this morning, which was about how alcohol is being affected in the trade wars that are going on. And so I like to say I have my wine Substack and then my non-wine Substack, which is called Weaponized Economy. And sometimes the themes mix and over this aspect of trade. But what I found, to sort of answer the other part of your question, is that starting as a pandemic project, I did wine tasting classes with the Wine and Spirits Educational Trust out of London. And I went up to sort of diploma level. So taking exams and doing other things. I said I'd do it as long as it was fun and I was learning things. Now, maybe my idea of fun involves memorizing a lot of things and understanding complex markets and understanding how climate change is changing industries.
The crops,
Kind of
yeah.
sounds like our work on energy, right? So I found it was a nice balance. And then for me, it also supported some of the charitable work that I do here in New York City with some meal programs. And so I saw it as a way I could give back, do some community building and raise some money for charity. So it was a nice kind of counterweight, or continues to be a nice counterweight. And it's definitely interesting cocktail party or event conversation. Whether people drink wine or not, it's sort of often an interesting conversation.
That's so interesting and fascinating. Congrats, Rachel.
Thanks, Leslie. I
Yes.
always really enjoy this. I mean, I enjoy all of your episodes, but I have always really admired the fact that, you bring in the sort of the personal and the evolution. It's a
Yeah.
really lovely
No, I
innovation
think
of
it
what
is
you do.
very inspiring for all of us. So, and if you have the next a date for the next testing or event, I'll put it in the show notes.
Wonderful.
Good, thank you so much, and we'll see what's going on with your run in coming days.
Yes, I know. We might be quite busy, right?
This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck. This episode was recorded on February 20, 2026. If you like what you hear, want to support Energy Vista, discuss sponsorship, or send feedback, contact me.